Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Procurement's Golden Opportunity, Driving M&A Synergies and Value, presented by GEP and the Hackett Group. This is, as you all know, a very timely topic. CNBC reported that M&A activity across the world hit a 17-year record high in the first quarter of 2018. Our discussion today will focus on the very significant potential for procurement to contribute to the success of a merger or acquisition by helping the newly combined enterprise find and sustain the critical synergies that will promote innovation and realize savings targets. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We're joined by Konstantin Limbarakis, Senior Research Director for Procurement at the Hackett Group, and Mukund Acharya, Vice President of Global Delivery at GEP. We have here two procurement experts with deep knowledge and experience in the M&A realm. And Mukund is actually the author of the white paper that's available on the resource list. I think we can promise you a very engaging and enlightening discussion with Konstantin and Mukund on deck here. So, without further ado, let's get this webinar started. We'll lead off with Konstantin Limbarakis of the Hackett Group. Off to you, Konstantin.
Thank you, Edie, for that introduction, and thank you for hosting the Hackett Group here today on this webcast. Just a brief intro on my background. I'm the Senior Research Director at the Hackett Group, and this topic was one, as Edie kind of hinted at, one that's always top of mind and something that's ever playing in the minds of business globally. And as we've seen, there's just always been a tumult that happens with regard to M&A, and we thought it would be a great topic to introduce as part of a discussion framework with our partner GEP. So, Mukund, do you have any thoughts as well as part of your introduction?
Thanks, Konstantin. So, hello, everyone. My name is Mukund Acharya. As Edie said, I'm a Vice President of Global Delivery at GEP. I work cross-industry, and really my focus is on procurement. My background really focuses on procurement transformation and looking at cases where we have either acquisitions or divestitures and try to see how we can get the maximum value and savings for our clients. Like Konstantin, I'm looking forward to this discussion. I hope you all find it enjoyable. We had a great time developing the content, and I'm sure it'll be something that you could learn a lot from. With that, let's move to the next slide. So a quick introduction to GEP. We're a technology and consulting firm. We focus exclusively on procurement. So we look at the entire gamut from source to contract and procure to pay. We have a custom in-house tool we've developed to handle the entire source to pay area. The tool is called SMART. It's a technology platform that we use on a number of our engagements, both from a spend tracking, spend management standpoint, but also from the processing of invoices on the procure-to-pay area. As a company, we have handled, on average, about $95 billion in spend a year. We also have a global delivery center in Mumbai, in Costa Rica, and in Prague, and offices in a few other locations. We focus on a number of areas in procurement. The one that I think of interest to most people on this call is around acquisitions and divestitures. And we look forward to sharing some of our insights, capabilities, and learnings. Thank you. Konstantin?
Thank you, Mukund. Before we jump into the slides, I also wanted to do a brief intro of the Hackett Group. For those of you that are familiar, Hackett Group is a large consulting and advisory firm. As part of what we're talking about here today is we provide advisory information and advisory services to our clients around areas of best practices, research, webcasts such as this one, in-person events, value accelerators, provision of metrics based on our research, peer-to-leader interaction, and implementable constructs. Based on that framework, we have a dedicated advisor capability. We provide our client needs and initiatives and provide high impact client ROI with the goal of helping our clients transform their businesses by improving the performance by using the IP that we provide through various parts of our research. As part of that, I had that up here at the Hackett Group, and as we had mentioned earlier, M&A has become a topic of great interest for many of our clients, particularly as it relates to the value drivers that we're seeing organizations getting from the M&A process. In fact, there's a lot of research happening right now that is looking at M&A as a digital transformation enabler that is really helping organizations better understand how to acquire companies and how to go about that process in a much more effective and best practice format. And what I'd like to share with you in the next several slides here is basically some of the best practices and information that we've seen and some of the challenges that organizations have had and why. Part of this is based on some third-party data that is out there that is actually a very useful resource. A company called IMAA Institutes focused exclusively on merger and acquisition activity. And based on the data that they shared, they found that in 2017, companies announced about 50,000 transactions with the total value globally of around $3.5 trillion. And what they're finding is that compared to 2016, the numbers in deals grew only kind of marginally by 2.9%, while the value declined by 2%. As we go into 2018 and we start looking at, say, the midpoint of the year, it's interesting to see where M&As will end up happening and where they'll come out. But historically, M&A activity has also seen a very industry-type focused way of looking at what's happening. And what this institute found is that an overview that since 1985, the value of the transactions where most of these deals have happened is really around the energy and power industry as well as in financial. So when you look at the big picture, and if you're in an industry that fits the high volume of M&A activity, it might be worth, I would say, noting some of these data points to understand what could happen if you have merger happening in your organization. So with that, I'd like to also take a look at some of the points here on the aspect of how mergers happen. So since when you're looking at some of the data points around percentage savings as a percent of total merger synergies, we can see that outside expenditures can account for a large portion of the company's cost structure, procurement, and procurement's fertile ground for post-merger integration activity. So what we can see here is procurement synergies can account for a significant portion, particularly in industries such as food processing, auto and trucks, and aerospace. And horizontal mergers can really yield some of the largest and straightforward synergies because of the similar spending patterns that you can find. One of the challenges that we've also found is that because many mergers do not achieve a full value, the reason for that is really that they have a failure to achieve the full potential of savings available from well-planned or well-executed programs. And according to a real good HBR article, Harvard Business Review, they found that failure rates for mergers and acquisitions sits between 70 to 90%. Now, there's been some more recent data, surveys and data that's out there that we're also working at Hackett that shows that some of these numbers, these rates of failure have gone down because of improvements in technology or improvements in the enhancement of information. But the core of the problem still is very high in the M&A itself because too many executives often have insufficient discipline in the way they're evaluating and what they're doing to fuel these deals. And the importance here is in finding a better way to accurately identify and calculate what the value of that synergy can do and the diligence that's required to go through that process. And often, as the article points out, some of the weakest assumptions involve the estimates of what the additional revenue the companies can generate when combined, because they're not really looking at the organization of how those assets will truly operate together. And one of the root causes for that is that we find from our Hackett research that it's often in planning errors as well as execution errors related to change management and cultural alignment between both companies. There are several horror stories that if you go out there and you look at some of those things, anything from Quaker Oats and Snapple to the Kmart Sears deal to some of the others that have had, you know, huge impairments as to the reason why they weren't successful. Much of that has to do with the absence of this due diligence towards the supply chain before the deal has been done. So key decisions on savings numbers then are actually made often in the realm of finance, looking at top-line revenue, looking at PE ratios, looking at the impact of the shareholder value as a way of bringing the companies together. And this is really then often done in a quick format, and there's an expectation to deliver quick results in a short space of time. But the process for going through that in purely a financial way is often very flawed because it really lacks the fundamentals of how do I actually execute and do this operationally. And considering the impact of suppliers on our business, this could have a huge impact with the way we're actually buying and selling our products through the supply chain. In this regard, not consulting procurement and how to plan earlier could have a huge impact on the success of integrating the two organizations, and not recognizing the full potential of cost savings from the supply chain because you haven't gone through the due diligence of recognizing what the potential synergies are, particularly with who you're buying from, the contracts that exist, and the overall category management that's there. This is a slide that Kund had put together too that I decided to present here because it also hits fundamentally at the point that we're trying to make. Nearly 50% of the synergy benefits in M&A deals often come from integrating suppliers and purchasing processes. Again, as I mentioned before, because of the impact of what suppliers could potentially mean on the organization as you're working functionally, this could have a huge impact on the success. So achieving these goals is easier said than done, and the considerations that often have to go into place include bringing together often very disparate systems from global sources of supply, having the different contractual relationships globally, maybe several different procurement or even ERP systems, and procurement teams and cultures may vary based on the intricacies involved in realizing the synergy benefits. This might be because of the industry they're in or even a different aspect of the industry that has a different level of supply base or different types of suppliers or different ways of doing business. Along with this, tight deadlines and often lofty expectations from these shareholders when going through these processes without the proper due diligence puts a lot of pressure on the CPOs, and they're faced with this challenge once the M&A deal is done. A way to try to address this and addressing the source to settle process framework in M&A, we can look at the big process by taking a step back and understanding what source to pay means and the processes that are involved. If we break this down and look at it from a categorization in the index that I have on the slide, we can see part of this might be looking at spend analysis and category profiling, strategic direction and prioritization with categories, doing your spend analysis due diligence. We could also see as part of the sourcing and transaction setup, the implementation of sourcing opportunities is clear. Is how you start going from an analysis of the spend to minimizing or contracting the spend you have maybe with multiple suppliers by executing sourcing events. We could also look at the supplier profiles and understand what suppliers we may want to consolidate, or even in some cases where we have duplicate suppliers and have multiple contracts with the same suppliers, which provides an opportunity to do contract inventory and gap analysis, better contracting with the suppliers, getting better payment terms, and better understanding the way we can improve the compliance with the contracts that are out there. Finally, there's another area that often gets overlooked, particularly for procurement, which is really in the area of working capital optimization. There was a study that Hackett done a few years back looking at capital optimization, and in a place where procurement coordinates with accounts payable, there's a huge opportunity for procurement strategies in terms of cost and cash supplier categorization and consolidation, as well as goods receipt and invoice timing to improve the payment run frequency and improve the way we're managing that working capital as part of that merger process. When we take a look at key questions then to address as part of a structured approach to M&A, we can see that there are some fundamental things we need to look at. Key questions include, what are the immediate sourcing opportunities to leverage newly consolidated spend? So it goes back to that sourcing opportunity. What contracts does the merged entity have in place? Where are there redundancies? Which contracts have the best terms and which are set to expire? So maybe we can go through the merger process and take an opportunity to renegotiate those contracts. Particularly for direct materials, what is the impact of product design and parts to be standardized and improve the leverage of simplifying the supply chain? So if you're in a large computer organization or a hardware organization like the Dell case study I'll go through, we can see that there's huge opportunity, particularly if you know that there's common suppliers that are in somewhat of an oligopoly, and you know that you can simplify the process by renegotiating. How can our suppliers be better engaged? What are existing processes that can be leveraged from each organization? Maybe the acquired organization has already gone through a P2P process or gone through a reimplementation that has gone through the pain of understanding how to improve through digital transformation. What are policies and procedures needed to be updated? And finally, what's the opportunity for supporting the organization needed going forward? How do we understand what this potential of the new organization looks like? When we take a look at the overall process then, some of the things that we could understand is taking a truly structured approach to assessing the opportunities that are there. And when we look at the takeaways or say deliverables that the procurement organization might be responsible for, there's some distinct areas that I kind of hinted at earlier with the process slide that we really want to understand and take away. Now, Mukund is going to be talking about this as the way they do it at GEP and how they're actually executing these different types of strategies with their technology and process. But I'm going to highlight some of these here just to get an understanding and re-emphasize why these are so important. The first is really around the idea of a detailed spend analysis and category management around supplier profiles. So how do you break that down? What type of data sources do you have that allow you then to bring that information together? What are those sourcing opportunities and assessments that you have that you want to deliver in both the pre and post-merger states? What contract inventory and gap analysis exists? And the sourcing and procurement integration from both a source to contract process as well as a purchase to pay process, what those processes look like, how the organizations are set up. Do you have a global business center? Are you centralized? Are you decentralized? What does the new merger bring to that? And what are the existing systems and tools that are in place? Are you planning on having multiple instances of a same ERP that will maybe complicate the way you're using your e-procurement or source-to-pay system? Or are you trying to integrate those and use this as an opportunity to bring together commonality that will then declutter your process and data? Finally, some implementation strategies for sourcing opportunities. Maybe going through that quick step of supplier consolidation and contract negotiation, or even going through the competitive bidding of RFP source categories, reverse auctions, so you can create those newly negotiated contracts. And finally, as I'd mentioned earlier, the working capital optimizations. How are you working with finance and payables to better understand processes that may be inefficient today, that improve the resourcing strategies, that could improve the centralization of processing and outsourcing maybe of payment, as well as improving the credit cycles and the cash cycles that could improve the success of the merger itself. What I have here then is also kind of an illustrative framework that helps organizations just best understand there's no one best practice or other based on the size of a merger or based on the country and even which the merger is happening, but it gives you a basis to understand what are some of the key things you should be doing when you're pre-planning, even when the initial discussions are happening within the executive team. How do you make sure that procurement's getting a seat at the table early on to establish some of these key elements, such as getting that base spend baseline, understanding what those contracts are like, understanding the impact of the organizational structure, being able to assess the capabilities of the other procurement team that will be integrated, and then looking and creating this management plan to understand what are the savings plan potentials, the impacts, and even the branding of procurement. So if we consider what's the tradition of the experience of procurement within both organizations, how do you then improve that brand with a newly formed entity? Now, when you have that seat at the table earlier, you're able to then be more effective in the due diligence, to be able to work closely with the other areas of the business, like HR and supply chain, confirm your savings and understand what the risks potentially are in all that pre-merger process. Then finally, once you go post-merger, you can take a look at that first 100 days, establish the governance, and really find a way to evaluate the new information against those assumptions, see if those assumptions are even correct. And a lot of it has to do with the way that you're communicating with your internal stakeholders, but also being able to prioritize and integrate what you anticipated in the launching of those teams within the form of a task force. Finally, that integration requires implementation of the blueprint, trying to bring together the elements of those cultures, which is actually one of the most important things for success, is having those cultures work together that were in the past were set separate. Integrating the supply base and going beyond integrated savings to create additional value and benefit. So one of the most important things we've experienced is really that development of the first 100-day plan. Make sure, as I mentioned earlier, get involved in the planning stages from day one. Make sure that you have it clear, that you state what information is going to be discovered, what are the conflicts over assumptions, the resource, the style of which the organizations work. That's important. Make sure the integration task force is supported with a clear governance to drive delivery, and make sure that there's a means for establishing different waves of those targeted goals. And with how ambitious do you want to be in the beginning, or maybe do you want to try to make some quick wins with the newly formed organization to create some camaraderie first that helps align the value drivers and the integration of the overall strategy. So to do this, what you need to think about is what type of quick wins can you convey, what type of accelerated sourcing opportunities exist, what full strategic sourcing opportunities are there, and how do you develop those suppliers. As part of the due diligence process, too, there's some frameworks that we kind of want to impart here. One is, again, the organizational impact. What's the new structure of the team going to look like, the talent retention, and particularly for organizations that are going through transformational aspects of the merger. Digital transformation is really showing us that there's been a talent challenge, and that trying to maintain those subject matter experts as part of the process of reintegrating the businesses in things like RPA or process redesign is going to be really essential for bringing the two companies together. What type of supply chain assessments can you do on the supply chain that you currently have within your organization, whether it's dealing with the warehousing and the optimization, or actually the sourcing and execution with your suppliers? And the brand management, how are you looking at the brand of procurement? Finally, the value capture impacts. How are you looking at cost savings? What's your anticipated goal? How much savings are you expecting in the beginning versus the end? And does that have an impact based on how you're trying to consolidate your supply base and looking at what that supply base is, where often there might be certain suppliers that are unique or distinct, where in other cases in certain categories you may not. And then finally, process and system impacts. What kind of spend management systems do you have in place? Are you looking to consolidate and harmonize onto one platform? And what's your category management strategy for strategic sourcing? Are part of those all in one platform already, or are you really looking to integrate those onto one? Another key element then goes back to the integration and blueprint during an M&A. So these are all, I guess, 6 different areas, if you will, that the integration blueprint should map out in the new ways that procurement will function. And so the goal or the aim is to really achieve a company focus by standardizing procurement work for key enablers that essentially bring together a governance process for how the new organization will work, compliance elements, how you're working again on the supply chain, the system and process, the talent element, as I mentioned before. And again, one of the overarching barriers or things that have prevented organizations from working together is the culture. And that is really, again, it's so important as part of the due diligence. But once the execution and merger has already happened and the deal is done, bringing that culture together in a new way is essential. Finally, an example of a procurement integration work stream. This is just a model that we put together to show what are some of the things that you do organizationally from a process standpoint when you're for the acquired company to prep, and then some of the clean team activities. So examples of that from, say, an organizational standpoint are preparing documentation, getting all your documents together, making sure you're having an executive communication standpoint. When you're doing the spend and opportunity analysis, make sure you're trying to reprioritize or look at year 1 and year 2, roll out enhanced opportunities, and complete the opportunity documentation in a clear, succinct way. Roll out opportunity reporting, and really try to develop past and current projected spend analysis cues based on the data you're bringing in. And then the other element, again, as I mentioned, is really developing a way of creating a contract database, trying to harness all the tools that are out there. And this is part of the area that we're also seeing a lot of impact in areas like AI, where organizations are trying to enhance and improve the way they're identifying and finding contract language, and really trying to try and find better ways to improve the way they're flagging contract issues, and then essentially looking at those supplier overlaps and evaluating those key risks that might be there as part of the supply chain. Finally, on the clean team activity, what's the comparison? What's the new organization look like? How do we now define integration design scenarios based on how aggressive and accelerated we want to make the teams come together? Bringing together the spend consolidated cube for looking at different categories. So the opportunity analysis based on leveraging the acquired versus the acquiring company, the rebid volume or resourcing, looking at synergy targets, and then developing a plan for scenarios based on integrated organization. Finally, as part of the clean team activities, how do you document the supply-based overlaps, compare the contracts based on commodity and supplier, and review the operations for both organizations so you can kind of figure out how to bring those two organizations together and define a plan for day one for the procurement operations. One area that we see here, and again, this is a case study that we presented based on some discussions we had with Dell. Dell represented a $67 billion opportunity of bringing together both the EMC and Dell organization together. All of us are very familiar with Dell, maybe not so much with EMC, but the merger brought together a computing powerhouse with a storage powerhouse. Now, as part of what we were doing in preparing for this case for this webcast, we've recently come across the fact that there's now even another change happening potentially where VMware, which is a subsidiary company of Dell, might actually go through an IPO process and do what's called a reverse merger. As a result of, again, the quickly changing environment, this is the reason why it's so important to have a proper plan in place. Now, in the case of the Dell and EMC merger that happened last year, the companies really came together and found that culture was such an important part of it. The companies devised a value creation integration office to help manage it. In my discussion with the gentleman on the procurement side who helped manage the merger and integration for procurement, they considered the different categories of spend and supply base for both direct and indirect by creating spend playbooks up front. They also really accomplished the closure and transition service obligations, including looking at a replication of 1,300 supplier contracts that happened between both those organizations. They also looked at the procure-to-pay element, T&E management, and those things to help benefit the acquiring companies. Overall, their sourcing plan and timing were aligned on what they would reach, and their goal was within 12 months of the EMC acquisition to have it completely aligned and brought together. And part of it was also that it wasn't all about the merging. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that oftentimes as part of an M&A, there's divestiture that happens. So it wasn't even all about merging, but it also included, in their case, the divestiture of software and services where they needed to unwind certain parts of the business that didn't make sense with the newly merged organization. And finally, the end goal that they had in mind was do not impact the customer, do not impact the business, and be as transparent as you can to the organization. And if you look at some of the case studies that have been written since then, overall, there's been a very positive value, some of the growth, that has happened as a result of the merger. And if you even listen to some interviews with Michael Dell, they'll tell you it's been a positive growth, and the result is shareholder value. But what is it that they did to bring the procurement organizations together to ensure that operationally it would be successful? With that, what I'd like to do now is turn this over to Mukund, who's going to give you some more clear details on actually ways of executing that and how they do that at GEP today. So Mukund, it's all yours.
Thank you, Constantine. So, when I was looking through that initial section, I think what I can pull out from there is the fact that whatever research that Hackett has done, we see a lot of this. We do see a lot of issues that have been raised. We do see that the way to approach an acquisition or divestiture is very different from simply a sourcing program. And so as we at GEP started looking at this more and more carefully, we decided that beyond simply building a capability, we needed to have a set of rules or a playbook. So on the current slide, we've highlighted some of the big issues typically we see. This isn't exhaustive, but I think this covers some of the areas where we see there's room for improvement or potential pitfalls. The first piece is that merger benefits are not simply about procurement, but it covers every gamut or every piece of the puzzle. It looks at people, products, markets, manufacturing, R&D, and IT. The second piece we consider is that procurement savings are not simply savings. They often have to be time-phased. So there's a strong need to have immediate savings. There's a strong need to have midterm and longer-term savings. The amount of savings will vary from category to category, but also from time frame. Sometimes something has to be done that's quick just to get the initial savings and build momentum for the program. And in other cases, we see value in doing it right and taking time over it. Another aspect we have to consider is legal. There are times when, due to legal constraints, documents cannot be shared quickly or have to go through additional legal reviews. These are some things that we have to consider as we look at driving value for the company. So where does this lead us to? This leads us to the fact that a focused program that looks through all the data, looks through all the processes, and as an output creates a very objective wave plan of sourcing events. That is the only and best way to identify value for the company and identify value from synergies. The duration of such an assessment can vary. It varies on complexity, it varies on the time frame needed, but typically in our experience, we see it takes 8 to 10 weeks, sometimes as long as 12. The focus is often diluted by new processes, confusion on hierarchies and ownership, lack of good data. And so as we build this, the assessment has to factor in all these unknowns. So in order to do this, we developed a playbook. Can you move to the next slide, please, Constantine? So our playbook is not a one-size-fits-all. There are certain components that we use selectively, others may not be used, and others are emphasized more than others. So we look at across 4 different dimensions. We look at strategy, we look at governance, organization, and processes. Strategy focuses on the big picture. What is the corporate direction? What is the assessment to drive savings? What is the entire planning process? Governance is around decision-making, identifying the key deliverables. Organization and processes become a little more tactical. So when you look at organizations, it's about understanding the team setup, the team charter, what are different stage gates for approval and alignment on savings. And the processes, again, very tactical but highly critical. These look at areas like creation of a clean room, consolidation of spend analysis, spend categorization, collecting contracts, understanding which contracts can be worked on, which have to be deferred. And then often we look at the post-acquisition and divestiture analysis to see what worked, what didn't work well, what needed to get changed. So as we build this playbook, we can pick out different components to match the needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Next slide, please. So when we look at the process, one of the key points we've seen around any synergy type of savings, whether it's an acquisition or a divestiture, is on execution. So we put a lot of emphasis on execution. The main reason is the assessment gets us directionally aligned. It gives us a target, it gives us scope, it gives us the ability to know what to go after. The execution piece is what drives results. So as we've gone through, for many clients, this type of assessment or this type of program, the first question we hear is, when do I see savings? And sometimes it's a difficult discussion because savings are not easily obtainable. And they take time to deliver, they take time to negotiate. And so we often look at cases where we can drive savings sooner. Now, the other three areas that are frequently, I would say, downplayed, but are very critical, are around communication, senior leadership engagement and support, and change management. And I'll get into some of these in a little more detail on subsequent slides. In a nutshell, there's no silver bullet. There's no magical way of getting savings quickly. It does take a lot of rigorous analysis. It does take a lot of services and technology as needed. We often look at a tool simply as a data repository or a contract repository or for spend analysis. But we don't necessarily implement a solution via a tool, mainly due to the time frame required. The focus is often then on quickly identifying what the opportunities are and driving a sustainable sourcing process to identify and capture savings. And the last bullet point simply reiterates what I said. There's always this tension between get savings quickly and get the maximum possible savings. The maximum possible savings is key to any program, but quite often a few quick wins builds a lot of energy and builds a lot of momentum that should not be overlooked. So what are some of the key factors, key success factors for execution? What we've done often is simply looking at spend, quickly categorize the spend, do a review of contracts, and validation of savings targets. Quite often, as part of an acquisition, the savings targets are set at a very high level. They're based on a certain amount of spend, a percentage is sometimes placed against it, and then procurement is told to deliver on those savings. That can be very challenging. So as we move into execution, our first thing is to validate these savings, is to look at the existing contracts, is to look at the spend, confirm the categorization, and then based on spend and contract flexibility, we build a wave plan. The wave plan is critical. It helps us identify what the savings are, but it also helps us identify when the savings will happen. It helps us understand capacity issues. It helps us build a set of uniform and common guidelines as to what procurement will do and help the organization, and the use of the business and the requirements from business. We often look at something called contract harmonization, which is exactly what it sounds like. Simply taking some of the high spend areas or high spend suppliers or contracts and putting them in a grid, we can quickly identify common areas or common suppliers and ones that often provide the same service. In those cases, there may be a choice to either simply consolidate or, if needed, combine the spend and then go to market in RFP. The lastly and the most obvious is a structured strategic sourcing process. This one enables identification and implementation of savings. It's a standardized approach. Whether you use a 5-step or a 7-step, it follows the same key principles. So as you can see on this slide, a lot of what I've discussed is very obvious, it's very tactical, but it's highly critical. And this is, from an execution standpoint, we see this to be some of the key drivers to success. The next point I want to bring up is communication. So at any time when we have a new program and a joint requirement from the entire business, there's a tendency not to communicate that well. The communication can often seem like an add-on. It can seem like a, hey, procurement is trying to deliver savings. In our experience, there's more to that, and having a strong communication plan really helps from a situation where you have an acquisition or divestiture. The 4 key points that we find work are, first one, early and often. Especially for 2 companies merging with different cultures, the importance to have a standardized set of communication policies, a standardized set of messaging to the organization is critical. There's always concern about who's saving what, who gets credit, which organization does what, and so having this communication early and often is very critical. The second piece to look at is project kickoff. This is done mainly to drive understanding for the project, is to build excitement, is to make sure that not just procurement, but also the business has an equal stake in the success of the synergy program. Then on an ongoing basis, we have day-to-day activities that highlight the successes of individual projects. This is a good way to communicate not just project status, but also key successes. And it's tied closely to the recognition communication, where we like to emphasize the value that is driven of individual projects by individual people. This sense of I own it rather than I'm doing the work is key. It also helps show the entire organization that any key success is not driven by one person doing a lot of work, but overall communication and coordination across the enterprise. The other area of success or success factor is senior leadership engagement and support. So in any organization, having this support is important, but for a situation where you have 2 organizations coming together, a senior level sponsor and a steering committee to help with issue resolution is critical. I won't get into some of the tactical things the steering committee does, but their broad mandate is simply to be champions. It is to recognize and push the value of the program. It is to show the benefits of a single voice and support at every level of the organization to synergy savings. And it is to drive the right organizational behavior. People take cues from their leaders, and if these cues are blurred or not made clear, then people read into it as they will. The value of having a good, strong leadership program and a steering committee is that it forces the organization to understand and acknowledge that synergy savings are critical. They're not a nice to have, they're a must have. And for this, we see the formation of a strong steering committee to be very important and very necessary, so that the program as a whole is known, it's a branded issue, and it is communicated clearly through the organization. The next one next success factor that I want to cover is something that typically is treated very loosely. It falls under change management. The biggest challenge of any acquisition is that you've brought together two companies with possibly very, very different cultures. They have different ways of doing work, they have different processes, they set goals differently, and they may have different incentives. So for a program like this to work, you have to get everyone aligned and pointing the same direction. Everyone needs to know what the savings targets are, they need to know their role, and they need to be recognized. And so change management plays a strong role here. This isn't simply about sending out memos. This is about understanding what drives each culture and what are viewed as key drivers to success. When we look at situations like this, quite often it is the role of HR to get involved and provide uniformity on incentives. It is to help provide clarity on what is valued and what isn't. It's also critical to make sure that both companies are aligned on the same goal, that they recognize that their work will be noticed and rewarded if they work in a team and not individually. The phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast, it's a common one. I'm sure all of you have heard it. But it is very true. We can have the best strategies in the world, but if the culture is not supportive to it and the culture is not aligned to it, then synergy programs fail. So those, in a nutshell, cover some of the key areas where we feel success for any program is dependent on. With that, I'm going to move to a case study related to an actual acquisition. So this is a $10 billion utility. The two companies were merging, had a combined annual revenue of 10 and procurement spend of $4 billion. And they needed to earn the acquisition premium in 2 years, blend the culture, and limit any upfront investment. So our team did a spend analysis for 20 categories across 50,000 suppliers. They built a very detailed opportunity assessment. They assessed savings opportunities and developed a 90, 183, 160-day launch plan. Now, I know earlier we had talked about a 100-day launch plan. These are all subjective, but the key theme for a lot of these is simply what is the value? How quickly can I see the money? Sometimes we might do a 30-day plan simply to identify a few low-value projects that can show some savings. Again, the value is shown not by the savings amount, but the fact that the program has momentum and is delivering some form of value from a very early stage. We looked at all sorts of sourcing approaches, ranging from specification rationalization, demand management, incumbent negotiations, RFPs. And then used a lot of our information, our data, to build best practices and provide templates. So the results, we achieved 6% in synergy savings. We introduced new suppliers in the mix and consolidated a lot of the spend to drive savings. We also implemented best practices from a commercial standpoint, including rebate structures tying to commodity indexes and payment terms. So cases like this can be very complicated. They can involve a lot of process work, but they also have to be time-bound. They have to provide results quickly. And complexity on this was supported by a very strong governance structure. It was supported by complete buy-in from senior leadership, and it had the right level of support across the entire organization. These are all key success factors I mentioned earlier, and the success of this particular assessment reflected all that. The second case study, I think, which might also be of really good interest, is it was a acquisition by a retailer, and they acquired another brand to enhance their product portfolio. The interesting thing here was that targets were set as part of the acquisition, and we were brought in to help realize those targets. Now, the challenge here is that there is no going back. As a publicly held company, the savings targets were sold to the street, and so there's a commitment by the company to deliver. They had $250 million in savings, of which roughly 50 plus was based on what would be provided by indirect procurement. Again, similar to what we did in other cases, we had a branded program with a formal kickoff. We had strong C-level governance and support from the overall business leads. We looked at over $1 billion in indirect spend and all key supplier contracts, and then built a wave plan effectively to go after these savings over the period of 2 to 3 years. Key results: we delivered a few quick wins in the first 3 months. We not only exceeded our original savings target, but we did it ahead of schedule. So these are two pieces of information I thought were really good because they really helped validate the approach. They helped validate how we addressed key roadblocks and essentially made this a success. So I thank you for the time. With that, I will hand the next slides over to Konstantin. Konstantin?
Yeah, for the sake of time, we wanted to move just to our Q&A here because we have some extra kind of conclusion slides here that we could provide in the deck. But we wanted to make sure we provided adequate time for a Q&A. So I guess at this point, Edie, we're going to open this up for Q&A for some questions here that we have, I guess, in the last 8 minutes or so of our webcast.
Okay, sure. We do have a couple of audience questions that have come in, so we're happy for the participation from the audience. Here is one that I want to throw to you guys to answer. What are your top 3 watch-outs if you are selling a part of your current business? So I guess this relates more to the divestiture point that Mukund was making earlier.
When you, for the person who had the question, when you say watch outs, you mean from a savings standpoint, or could you provide a little bit more context?
I think by watch outs, what is really meant is just in a general perspective on things to be aware of, things that could be potential pitfalls.
Oh, okay. No, that helps. So I think the key point for any divestiture is one of the things we see is the impact on spend of existing contracts. So if you're a company that's spending, say, $50 million with a supplier and the supplier is providing rebates or preferred pricing or tiered pricing, if that spend drops to 25, you could end up losing a lot of potential savings. Now, that's not a reason not to obviously do the divestiture, but that is something that needs to be kept in mind. What is the impact on not just the remaining company, but also divesting company, because you effectively reduce your spend base with a supplier. Secondly, related to contracts, sorry, I'll finish this and hand it to Konstantin. Secondly, related to contracts is to make sure there are no issues with spend being split from a contractual standpoint. And that would be, I think, the 2 things I'd watch out for. Konstantin?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that would be really planning almost everything in reverse of what you planned with the merger. So as I'd mentioned, is having a dedicated team as part of the process oftentimes when you're going through the M&A, you realize that there's divestiture that happened, like the Dell case study that I gave. But again, I think what's critical is that you have a dedicated team that goes through that process, that is able to look at the contracts and be able to look at the suppliers and also the risks that are involved. So in an example, when I spoke to the head of the merger and divestiture practice with Dell, he mentioned to me that in some cases they held on to certain contracts because it was still beneficial to them to keep them as a joint entity. So they worked on the contract to do that before the actual final divestiture happened. So those are things that pop up that you may not be aware of or not expect. But that's an example of one situation at Dell that they said during the merger with EMC, and they were trying to divest a couple of their businesses after that.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question before we hit the 1 hour mark. If one of you or both of you can take a shot at this question, kind of from a basic standpoint, what are some ways that procurement can get a seat at the table in the M&A environment?
Yeah, I think that is actually a really important one. So with part of it is internal networking to make sure that the C-level group understands what procurement can deliver and how they deliver it. Some of it is behavioral and cultural to make sure that procurement is always viewed as a partner and not someone you go to sign contracts. There's no hard and fast rule. It depends on the company and the culture. But procurement's involvement is key. And it's the best way to do it is simply to push to get a seat at the table.
Yeah, and I would also just say get involved early. So some of the examples I gave earlier in the presentation, making sure that you have a voice to make sure they understand the importance of how procurement can have an impact is critical. So it's part of the culture as well.
Okay, we might be able to squeeze in one more, actually. A question regarding to expediting the process. How I guess the real impetus is to realize the savings and from the synergies that are created in a merger situation. So are there any ways of expediting that process and getting the results faster?
I'll take this one real quick, Mukund. I think I hinted at it earlier in the slide deck. I think if you plan an M&A as part of a digital transformation process, that's become one of the defining reasons why companies are going through mergers and acquisitions today, is acquisitions of assets and IP. And if you're looking at doing the acquisition as part of that process, that could help accelerate the resources that are needed in order to help expedite the process and get the two cultures together. So I think that to me is one of the things, the trend that we're seeing overall, how organizations are trying to expedite the M&A process, tying it to digital transformation. Absolutely.
All right. I believe that we have just about arrived at the 1 hour mark for this presentation. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today's webinar. It's definitely a timely topic of great interest to many people in the current business environment, with the scramble for not just cost savings, but for it to bring more innovation into the enterprise, as Konstantin just mentioned. So I do want to thank all of you in our audience today for attending, and especially a huge thank you to Konstantin and Mukund for facilitating today's discussion.